toasting to a great year.
Here, here. And the food is absolutely delicious. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad you all are enjoying it.
This influx of returning servicemen, facilitated by the GI Bill, profoundly altered the social fabric of our universities and the trajectory of the American middle class.
My grandfather came home from the Pacific in October of 1945. He had been at Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan, the islands we talked about in an earlier episode of this series. And he came home to a small house in Indiana with a wife he had married before the war and a daughter born after he shipped out whom he was meeting for the first time. He was 26 years old. He had been gone for 3 years. He went back to work at the hardware store where he had worked before the war. He mowed his lawn on Saturdays and went to church on Sundays and coached Little League in the summers, and by any visible measure was indistinguishable from every other man on his block, every other man in his town, every other man of his generation who had come home and picked up the thread of ordinary life and continued. He didn't talk about the war, not to my grandmother, not to his children, not to anyone. As far as I ever knew, there were things in his garage, a Japanese rifle, some photographs, a box of documents. That nobody touched. My grandmother said he had nightmares for years after he came home. She said he would wake up in the dark, sometimes shouting, sometimes just sitting bolt upright and staring at nothing for what felt like a long time before he came back. She said she learned not to touch him when he was like that, because he would lash out without knowing he was doing it. She said it got better over the years. Mostly better. He died in 1978. I was 6 years old. I have one memory of him, sitting at the kitchen table, not saying much, watching me eat a piece of pie. He seemed very still to me, very far away from the kitchen where he was sitting. I didn't know why then. I think I know now. This is the final episode of this series, and I wanted to be about the men and women who fought the Second World War, and then came home to live the rest of their lives with what the war had done to them, not just the physical wounds, though those were real and extensive, and we will talk about them. The other wounds, the ones that didn't show on the outside, the ones that the medicine of the time didn't know how to treat because it didn't fully understand what they were, the ones that the culture of the time didn't know how to talk about because the language for them didn't exist yet, and the social permission to acknowledge them was limited by a generation's sense of what it meant to be strong. The generation that fought the Second World War was not, in general, a generation that complained. They had come to depression, years of poverty and uncertainty that had required endurance and resilience as a daily condition of life. They had fought a war that required everything they had and more. And when they came home, the prevailing cultural expectation was that they would put the war behind them and get on with living. The country was prosperous. The enemies were defeated. The future was open. What was there to complain about? This expectation that the veterans would simply resume their lives as if the war had been an interruption rather than a transformation was not malicious. It was an expression of genuine gratitude and genuine relief, a collective desire to believe that the hardest part was over and that the men and women who had fought deserved to enjoy the peace they had won. But it was also an expectation that could not be met by many of the people it was aimed at, and the gap between the expectation and the reality produced suffering that was largely invisible and largely unaddressed for years, and in some cases for lifetimes. I want to take a moment before we go further and ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. This series has tried to tell the full truth about the Second World War, not just the strategy in the battles, but the human cost, the specific people, the things that don't fit easily into the triumphalist narrative of the greatest generation. This final episode is the most personal of all of them. Subscribe, share this with someone who should be watching, and stay with me to the end. Back to the men who came home. Back to the thing that came home with them. The specific demographic scale of the Second World War's psychological impact becomes clear when you consider the numbers. Approximately 16 million Americans served in the military during the war. Of these, roughly 1 million served in combat roles that involved direct engagement of the enemy, exposure to incoming fire, and the specific experiences of killing and seeing people killed that are the primary sources of combat-related trauma. The combat veterans who came home in 1945 and 1946 were not a small or marginal population. They were a large fraction of an entire generation of American men. and the psychological wounds they carried were distributed across American society in ways that shaped the culture of the post-war decades. The specific occupational and social distribution of combat veterans in post-war America means that the psychological consequences of the war were present in every sector of American life. In the factories and the offices, in the schoolrooms and the courtrooms, in the government buildings and the churches, and the sports teams and the civic organizations. The men who had been at Tarawa were working alongside men who had been in the North Atlantic and men who had been in the Hurtgen Forest, in workplaces and communities where none of them talked about it, and all of them managed what they carried. The specific social institutions of mid-20th century American masculinity, the culture of stoicism and emotional restraint, the emphasis on self-reliance and the suppression of vulnerability, the identification of manhood with the ability to handle difficulty without complaint, were both a product of the veteran generation's experience and a constraint on their ability to address what their experience had done to them. The same cultural values that had helped them endure the war were making it harder for them to seek help for what the war had left. The specific case histories that emerged from the limited clinical literature of the period, the memoirs of VA psychiatrists, the oral histories of veterans who did eventually seek treatment, the accounts of spouses and family members, paint a picture of enormous variation in severity of the symptoms and the effectiveness of the coping mechanisms that veterans found. Some men managed their symptoms through work and community and the passage of time, building lives of genuine satisfaction and genuine connection. Others were more significantly impaired, their symptoms more severe, or their coping mechanisms less effective, and their post-war lives were marked by the war in ways that were visible to people around them even if not named or understood. The specific case of alcohol use among veterans deserves particular attention because it was so widespread and so consequential for families affected. The data on post-war drinking patterns among veterans is not comprehensive. The social stigma attached to problem drinking in the post-war period meant that much of it was invisible to official records, but the clinical accounts and the family histories that have been recorded suggest that alcohol use as a coping mechanism for psychological symptoms was extremely common. The VFW Hall and the Legion Post served their psychological function, in part through the alcohol that was available there. And the use of alcohol to dampen the symptoms of hypervigilance and intrusive memories was a rational short-term coping strategy that frequently became a long-term problem. The children of veterans who drank heavily experienced their own form of secondary trauma. The specific experience of growing up with a parent whose drinking was shaping the family environment in ways that the children could feel but not always understand or name. The intergenerational transmission of trauma, the way that unprocessed traumatic experience in one generation shapes the psychological environment of the next, is a phenomenon that the research literature has documented extensively, though its mechanisms are not fully understood. The boomers who grew up in households shaped by their fathers' unprocessed combat trauma were not immune to its effects, even when those effects were invisible and unnamed. The women who waited for the veterans to return also carried a form of the war's psychological burden that has been less extensively examined. The years of wartime anxiety, the sustained uncertainty about whether the person they loved was alive, the telegrams that arrived with news that changed everything, the management of daily life in the absence of partner, while also managing the children and the work, had their own psychological costs. The women who received husbands and fathers who came home changed, who found themselves in relationships with men who were familiar and somehow different, who could not bridge the gap that the war had created without language or framework for what the gap was. These women found their own ways of managing, with varying degrees of success. The specific experience of wives and mothers and sisters of men who did not come home, of the Gold Star families who had lost someone, was another dimension of the war's psychological impact that was distributed across American society in the post-war years. The grief of wartime loss, particular individual-specific, was embedded in the larger structure of post-war triumphalism in ways that made it difficult to honor on its own terms. The country had won. The sacrifices had been worth it. The grief was supposed to be completed by the victory, and the women who found that it was not completed, that the absence of a specific person continued to be felt in the specific textures of daily life, were supposed to be consoled by the knowledge that the sacrifice had meaning. The meaning was real. The grief was also real. They did not cancel each other out. The specific oral histories that the Veterans History Project and similar institutions have collected represent an attempt to recover what the silence obscured, to get the veterans' own account of their experience before the last of them were gone. The project began in 2000 and has collected more than 110,000 first-person accounts from veterans of all American wars, with a significant concentration of World War II materials collected before the last surviving veterans of that war passed away. The accounts that have been recorded contain the specific, irreplaceable texture of individual experience, the voices of people who were there, describing what was like in the terms they chose and with the specific details they remembered. What these accounts reveal, consistently and across the diversity of experiences they represent, is the enduring force of specific memories. Men in their 80s and 90s, describing events of 60 and 70 years earlier, speak of the smells and the sounds and the specific visual details of their wartime experience with a clarity that suggests these memories were never actually distant, that they had been present all along, held in a specific place in the mind and the body, available to surface when the right question was asked or the right memory was triggered. The neuroscience of traumatic memory explains this specificity. Traumatic events are encoded differently from ordinary events, with more detail, more sensory specificity, and more emotional charge, because the neurochemical environment of extreme stress creates conditions that favor deep encoding. The amygdala, which processes emotional responses and plays a key role in fear conditioning, becomes hyperactive during traumatic events and contributes to the encoding of traumatic memories with specificity and an emotional force that ordinary memories do not have. This is why the flashback, the intrusive re-experiencing of a traumatic memory, has a character of immediacy and sensory reality that the veteran describes. It is not simply a memory being recalled. It is a memory being re-experienced, with the neurochemical processes that accompany the original experience being partially reinstated. The men who sat at kitchen tables in the late 1940s and stare at nothing, the men like my grandfather, whose wives learned not to touch them when they were like that, were experiencing something that was real and physical, a consequence of what their brains and bodies had been through, not a weakness of character or a failure of will. The culture that could not see this, that saw only a man sitting at his kitchen table and not the war that was happening inside him, was doing the best it could with the understanding it had. But it was not enough, and the people it failed paid the cost. The specific trajectory of the psychiatric understanding of combat trauma from the Second World War through the present is a story of gradual, imperfect, occasionally reversing progress that reflects the broader difficulty of incorporating mental health into a culture that prefers to understand human problems in physical or moral terms. The Korean War veterans, the men who fought in a war that began 5 years after the Second World War ended, in a conflict that the American public found less compelling and less clearly meaningful than the war against fascism, experienced a specific version of the returning veterans' challenge that prefigured what would become visible during and after Vietnam. The Korean War was not a victory in the same clear sense that the Second World War had been. It ended in an armistice that left the Korean peninsula divided essentially where it had been before the war began. The men who fought in it were not celebrated with the same intensity as the Second World War veterans, and the psychological consequences of their service were absorbed into broader post-war culture with even less acknowledgement than the Second World War veterans had received. The Vietnam War changed the landscape of American veterans' psychological care more dramatically than any other conflict since the Second World War. The specific circumstances of Vietnam, the political controversy of the war itself, the specific character of the combat, the hostile reception that many veterans received when they came home, create a veterans population whose psychological needs were more visible, more vocally expressed, and more politically organized than the Second World War veterans' needs had been. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the veterans advocacy organizations, the rap groups, and the self-help networks that Vietnam veterans developed, these were expressions of a generation that refused to absorb its suffering in silence. The advocacy of Vietnam veterans and the psychiatrists who worked with them produced a formal recognition of PTSD as a diagnostic category in the DSM-3 in 1980. This recognition was not simply an academic classification. It was a political and cultural statement that the experiences of combat veterans produced a specific, identifiable, treatable medical condition that was not a moral failing or character weakness. The formal recognition opened the door to research to treatment development, and eventually to the evidence-based therapies that have transformed the clinical management of PTSD in the decades since. The irony, and it is a painful one, is that the formal recognition came too late to benefit most of the Second World War veterans who had been carrying their symptoms for 35 years. The men who had come home in 1945 and managed without diagnosis or treatment for the better part of 4 decades were, by 1980, mostly in their 60s or older. Some of them were dead. Many of them had managed their symptoms into a kind of accommodation, not resolution, but a livable relationship with the thing they carried that was stable enough that the formal recognition of the condition did not significantly change their lives. But for the children and grandchildren of these veterans, and for the veterans themselves who were still living and still managing, the formal recognition mattered in ways that went beyond clinical treatment. It provided a framework for understanding what had happened, a vocabulary for what had been present but unnamed, and a form of validation that said, "What you experienced was real, it has a name, it is not your fault, and help is available." The specific challenge of treating PTSD in elderly patients, which is a situation that the Second World War veterans who survived into the 1980s and 1990s were in, is a specialized area of clinical practice that received increasing attention as the veteran population aged. The presentation of PTSD in older adults can differ from its presentation in younger adults. The avoidance behaviors that have been functional coping mechanisms for decades sometimes gave way, in late life, to increased symptom severity as the structures that had supported the avoidance, the work, the active parenting, the physical routines, were removed by retirement and aging. Men who had managed their symptoms successfully for 40 years sometimes found, in their 70s and 80s, that the symptoms were returning or intensifying. The VA's efforts to reach this population, to provide treatment to elderly veterans who might not have sought treatment earlier, were a specific institutional response to this clinical reality. Support groups for Second World War veterans, individual therapy adapted for older patients, and the outreach programs that attempted to connect veterans who had never accessed VA services with the services that were available to them. All of these represented the system's belated effort to address needs that had been present since 1945. The specific memorial and commemorative culture that developed around the Second World War in the post-war decades is another dimension of the veterans' experience that is worth examining. The construction of war memorials, from the local monuments in small town squares to the National World War II Memorial on the National Mall, dedicated in 2004, represents a cultural negotiation about how the war and the people who fought it should be remembered. The National World War II Memorial, designed to honor the 16 million Americans who served and the 400,000 who died, was controversial in its design and in the decade of advocacy required to bring it to completion. Advocacy conducted primarily by the veterans themselves, who were in their 70s and 80s by the time the memorial was finally dedicated. The dedication ceremony in April 2004, attended by veterans who were traveling from across the country with the knowledge that this might be their last large public gathering, had the character of final accounting. The generation's public statement that they had been there, and that what they had done mattered, and that it would be remembered. Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, published in 1998, had articulated a specific narrative about the World War II generation, one that was celebratory and admiring, and that captured something real about the generation's achievements, while arguably underestimating the complexity of what they had carried. The specific stories in Brokaw's book, the individual accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, were part of a broader cultural reclamation of the Second World War veterans' experience that was happening in the 1990s and 2000s, as the veterans themselves were dying in significant numbers, and the urgency of recording their accounts was becoming clear. Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan in 1998, which opened with the Normandy landing sequence that many veterans described as the most accurate representation of combat they had seen in any film, and the companion HBO series Band of Brothers, were part of the same cultural moment. The attempt to give the war and the people who fought a representation that honored the reality of the experience rather than the sanitized version that had dominated popular culture for decades. The veterans who saw Saving Private Ryan, and many of them did, some of them returning to the theaters multiple times, describe reactions that range from gratitude for the accuracy to acute distress at the re-triggering of memories that the film's combat sequences produced. The film's realism, which was what made it valuable as a representation of the actual experience, was also what made it a potentially traumatic stimulus for the men who had been there, the acknowledgement that this was the case, that a film could trigger genuine psychological symptoms in the men who had experienced what it depicted, was itself a form of recognition of what those men had been carrying. The last of the Second World War veterans are gone now, or nearly gone. The youngest possible surviving veteran of the war, someone who was 17 and lie about their age when they enlisted in 1945 and managed to see some form of service before the war ended, would be in their late 90s today. The generation is ending. Their children are old. Their grandchildren are middle-aged. The direct connection between the living memory of the war and the current population is breaking, and what remains is a historical record, the documents and the photographs and the films and the oral histories and the memoirs, and the specific cultural inheritance of a generation that fought the most destructive war in history and came home and did not, in general, talk about it. The inheritance is complex. It includes the prosperity and the institutions and the civic culture that the veterans and their generation built. It includes the specific psychological consequences that were transmitted through families and communities in ways that are still being understood. It includes the specific cultural silences that shape how the boomers and their children understand their own histories and their own emotional lives. And it includes the specific stories, the ones that were told and the ones that were not, that constitute the human record of what the war was and what it cost. That record is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. The specific experiences of the specific people who fought the war and came home and lived their lives are not fully recoverable from the documents and the oral histories that survive. What can be recovered is enough to understand, in general terms, what the experience was like and what it cost, enough to honor the people who had it with a more complete acknowledgement than the triumphalist narrative has always provided. They fought. They won. They came home. They carried what the war put inside them for the rest of their lives. They deserve better than silence. And the least we can do, 80 years later, is make sure we know that the silence was there, and that the thing it was silencing was real. The specific progress that has been made since the Second World War in understanding and treating combat-related trauma is real and significant. The clinical tools available to veterans today, the evidence-based therapies, the pharmacological treatments, the peer support programs, the specific understanding of trauma's neurobiological mechanisms are far superior to what was available in 1945. The cultural environment has also changed, however imperfectly. The acknowledgement of PTSD as a legitimate medical condition, the reduction of stigma around seeking mental health treatment, the specific support programs available to veterans represents progress, however incomplete, from the silence of the post-war period. But the specific men and women who fought the Second World War, who came home carrying what the war had put inside them, managed largely without these resources. They managed what they had, with the work and the drink and the silence and the VFW post, and the marriages that held and the marriages that didn't, and the children they raised in the shadow of a war they couldn't put down. They managed because they had no choice except to manage. And the world they built while managing, the prosperity and the institutions and the children who became the next generation, was, for all its imperfections, an extraordinary achievement by people who were carrying extraordinary burdens. That is the final truth of the Second World War. Not just that it was won, which it was at enormous cost. Not just that the victory mattered, which it did more than any other military outcome of the 20th century, but that the people who won it paid a price that extended far beyond the battlefield and lasted far beyond the surrender, and that they paid that price with dignity and a persistence that the triumphalist narrative celebrates without always fully seeing. My grandfather sat at the kitchen table and watched me eat a piece of pie. He was very still. He was very far away. He had been at Tarawa. He had done what was asked of him. He came home. He lived his life. He carried what he carried. That is the story of the men who came home. Every one of them, across 16 million American military lives and the uncountable millions of other lives on every side of the war. And it is the story that this series has tried to honor alongside the strategy and the battles and the intelligence and the production and the law and the diplomacy. The human cost, the specific people, the thing they carried. They deserve better than silence. They did their best with what they had. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. The specific treatments available to World War II veterans who sought help for psychological symptoms were limited by the state of psychiatric knowledge at the time, but they were not absent. The Army and Navy had, during the war itself, developed treatment approaches for acute combat stress reactions, what they call combat exhaustion or battle fatigue, that represented a significant advance over the First World War's approach of shooting deserters and shaming those who broke down. The principle that informed the best wartime psychiatric treatment was a concept called proximity, immediacy, and expectancy, treating men close to the front rather than evacuating them, treating them quickly rather than after symptoms had become entrenched, and treating them with the explicit expectation that they would return to combat. This approach, developed by psychiatrists like Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, was more effective than evacuation to rear area hospitals, which tended to reinforce the sick role and make return to duty less likely. The lesson that early treatment close to the source of the trauma was more effective than delayed treatment in a distant hospital was a genuine clinical advance that shaped subsequent treatment approaches. But the wartime treatment model was designed for acute reactions, for men who broke down in combat and needed to be stabilized and returned to duty. It was not designed for the long-term management of chronic symptoms in men who had returned to civilian life. The transition from the military psychiatric system to civilian mental health system, which in the late 1940s was still largely organized around institutional psychiatry in state hospitals, with limited outpatient care available, left a significant gap between the needs of returning veterans and the services available to meet them. The Veterans Administration established a network of psychiatric facilities and outpatient mental health services in the post-war period, partly in response to the lobbying of veterans organizations and partly in response to the visible dimension of the veterans' psychological needs. But the demand for these services significantly exceeded the supply, and the quality of the care varied enormously. The specific therapies that were available, primarily psychodynamic therapy derived from Freudian theory, and physical treatments, including electroconvulsive therapy and various pharmacological approaches, had limited effectiveness for the specific cluster of symptoms that we now recognize as PTSD. The specific mechanisms by which traumatic experience produces the symptoms of PTSD, the intrusive memories, the hypervigilance, the avoidance behaviors, the emotional numbing, were not understood in 1945 in the neurobiological terms that contemporary research has provided. The treatment approaches that have proven most effective for PTSD, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, EMDR, were not developed until the 1980s and 1990s, based on research that the World War II veterans generation did not live to benefit from. The men who came home in 1945 were managing their symptoms with whatever was available, and what was available was frequently inadequate. The specific experience of the men who fought in the Pacific Theater had particular features that distinguished it from the European experience, and that shaped the specific character of the psychological wounds they carried. The closeness and brutality of Pacific Island combat, the cave clearing, the nighttime infiltrations, the hand-to-hand fighting in conditions of extreme heat and disease, produced trauma with a specific character that was different from the industrial warfare of the European front. The racial dimension of the Pacific War, the dehumanization of the Japanese enemy that was visible in American wartime propaganda, and that shaped the way the war was fought and the way the killing was experienced, added another layer of psychological complexity that veterans of Pacific found difficult to process in the post-war civilian world. The specific acts of violence that combat soldiers performed or witnessed or survived were not things that could be discussed in the ordinary social world of post-war America. The culture had no framework for receiving these accounts and no vocabulary for honoring them as the specific human experiences they were. The result was that the experiences remained contained within the veteran, unshared and unprocessed, available to surface in the dark at unpredictable moments for years or decades after the war. The post-war literature that emerged from the veteran's experience provides some of the most revealing accounts of what coming home was actually like. Norman Mailer's A Naked and the Dead, James Jones's From Here to Eternity, Joseph Heller's Catch, 22, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. These were not simply war novels. They were attempts to give shape and language to experiences that the culture around the veterans was not providing language for. Vonnegut's famous sentence about the firebombing of Dresden, "So it goes," is a formal gesture toward the impossibility of adequate response to mass death, a piece of black humor that says something true about the psychological position of the survivor. The oral history projects that were eventually developed to capture the veterans' accounts, most notably the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, which has collected tens of thousands of video and audio recordings of veterans' testimony, have created a record that is both invaluable and incomplete. Invaluable because of specific voices and specific memories of people who are irreplaceable. Incomplete because the recordings, for the most part, were made late in the veterans' lives, filtered through decades of memory and the accumulated interpretive frameworks of a lifetime, and shaped by the social context of the recording itself. What the recordings consistently reveal is the specificity of the veterans' memories, the way that specific moments, specific places, specific sensory details are preserved with a clarity that the passage of decades has not dimmed. A veteran describing a firefight in the Pacific 50 years later will often recall the exact sound of the weapon, the specific smell of the air, the color of the light at the specific time of day, details that ordinary memory would not preserve, but that traumatic memory encodes with a specificity that is one of its defining characteristics. The intrusive memories of PTSD are not simply memories that recur. They are memories that recur with the full sensory force of the original experience, as if the distance of time has not diminished their immediacy. The specific communities that veterans built among themselves in the post-war years, the American Legion posts, the VFW halls, the informal gatherings of men who had served together and who maintained the connections of shared experience, served a psychological function that was only partially understood at the time. The ability to be with people who shared the experience, who did not need to have things explained, who understood without being told what the specific references meant. This was a form of validation and normalization that the veteran could not easily find in the broader civilian world. The VFW Hall and the Legion Post were places where the war could be present without having to be explained or justified or defended. A man could sit with other men who had been there, drink his beer, and have the war present in the room to the shared understanding that did not require words. This was not treatment. It did not address the specific psychological mechanisms of trauma, but it served a real function in the veterans' management of their experience, providing a social context in which the defining experience of their lives was recognized as a defining experience of community around them. The specific challenge of the transition from wartime to peacetime identity was one of the most psychologically demanding aspects of the post-war adjustment. The veterans had been in the military, part of a highly defined social structure, one with clear hierarchy, clear purpose, clear standards of performance, and clear community. The unit was the primary social reference, the source of meaning and belonging in the framework within which individual action was evaluated. Coming home meant leaving this structure and re-entering a civilian world that had different rules, different forms of hierarchy, different sources of meaning, and different ways of evaluating individual action. The GI Bill softened this transition for many veterans by providing educational and economic opportunities that gave the transition a concrete form and a clear goal. The college education that the GI Bill funded, which millions of veterans took advantage of, was not just an economic benefit. It was a social structure that provided purpose and community during the transition period, a framework within which the veteran could pursue a defined goal alongside others who were in a similar situation. The college campuses of the late 1940s were filled with veterans who were older and more serious than conventional college students and who formed their own subculture within the broader academic community. The housing benefit of the GI Bill, the subsidized mortgages allowed millions of veterans to purchase homes in the new suburban developments that were being built to accommodate the post-war population, creating a material foundation for the family life that the post-war culture was promoting as the appropriate destiny for returning veterans. The suburbs of the 1950s, with their uniform lawns and their domestic privacy, were built partly on the GI Bill's housing provisions, and the particular psychology of those suburbs, the conformity, the emphasis on external appearance and the suppression of what lay beneath, was not unrelated to the specific psychological needs of a generation that was trying to build ordinary lives on extraordinary foundations. The relationship between the veterans and their children, the boomers who were the first generation born into the post-war prosperity, was shaped by the specific silence that the veterans maintained about their experience. The silence was, in part, a form of protection, the veteran's attempt to spare his children the burden of what he'd seen. It was also, in part, a form of the avoidance that is characteristic of PTSD. the effort not to engage with material that triggers a traumatic response. And it was, in part, simply the product of a generation and a culture that did not have language for the experience and did not know how to share it even if they wanted to. The children who grew up in that silence are now themselves old, and many of them are only now, in the late years of their lives, beginning to understand what their fathers carried and why. The archival work, the oral histories, the memoirs and the documentaries that have emerged in the decades since the war ended have provided a framework for understanding that was not available to them when they were growing up. The veterans who did not talk are mostly gone now, and the silence they maintain has become, for their survivors, both a mystery and a form of inheritance. The condition that we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was not called that in 1945. It wasn't called anything, officially, for most of the period immediately after the war. The symptoms have been observed and described in earlier conflicts, shell shock in the First World War, soldiers hard in the Civil War. But the understanding of what these conditions were, how they worked in the brain and the body, and how they could be treated was limited and inconsistent. The returning veterans of the Second World War who experienced what we would now recognize as PTSD faced a medical establishment that was better equipped to address the condition than it had been after the First World War. The Army and Navy psychiatrists who had served in the war had accumulated significant experience with combat stress reactions and had developed treatment approaches that were more effective than what had been available before. But that was still far from adequate to the scale and the character of what the veterans were carrying. The numbers, to the extent they could be reconstructed, suggest that the psychological impact of the war was enormous. Studies conducted in the post-war period found that a significant proportion of combat veterans, estimates vary but consistently suggest a substantial minority, experienced persistent psychological symptoms that affected their daily functioning for months or years after the war. Nightmares, hypervigilance, startle responses to sounds or movements that recalled combat, emotional numbing, difficulty trusting or feeling close to the people around them, explosive anger that seemed disproportionate to its immediate triggers, substance use as a coping mechanism. The cluster of symptoms that we now recognize as PTSD was present in large numbers of returning veterans, producing suffering that was real and extensive. What made the post-war situation particularly difficult was the cultural context in which the veterans were trying to manage these symptoms. The prevailing masculine culture of the 1940s and 1950s had no framework for acknowledging that what the veterans were experiencing was a legitimate medical condition rather than a personal failure of will or character. The word coward had been a real and operative social category during the war itself. Men who broke down in combat or who refused to fight or who could not function under fire had been subject to court-martial, shaming, and in some cases execution for cowardice or desertion. The veterans who came home carrying psychological wounds were trying to manage those wounds in a social context that still, implicitly, understood psychological difficulty as a form of weakness. The effect of this cultural context was to drive the symptoms underground, to create conditions in which the veterans did not acknowledge what they were experiencing, did not seek treatment, and manage their symptoms through the mechanisms that were socially available to them: work, drink, silence. The post-war American economy was providing work in abundance. The GI Bill had opened educational and economic opportunities that created a large and relatively prosperous middle class from a generation of men who had grown up in Depression-era poverty. Work provided structure, purpose, and a social identity that did not require engaging with what the war had done. Drink provided a specific mechanism for dampening the symptoms at the cost of its own set of consequences for families and relationships. And silence, the massive, collective, multi-generational silence about what the war had actually been like at the individual human level, provided the social permission to leave the worst of it unaddressed. The families of the veterans paid a portion of the price for this silence. The children who grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally elsewhere, who didn't understand why their father would react so intensely to certain sounds or situations, who were afraid of the anger that came without warning and didn't know what they had done to cause it, who sensed that there was something their father carried that he would never share with them. These children experienced their own secondary trauma, their own effects of a wound they could not see and were not given language to understand. The marriages of the returning veterans were statistically more fragile than the popular narrative of post-war family stability acknowledges. The divorce rate rose significantly in the immediate post-war years, not only because wartime marriages made hastily before deployment were tested by the reality of sustained cohabitation, but because the men who came home were, in many cases, not the men who had left. The war had changed them in ways that were not always visible and not always comprehensible to the women who had waited for them. The gap between who the man had been and who he was now, and the inability to bridge that gap through conversation or understanding, ended marriages that both parties might have wanted to preserve. The physical wounds of the war were more visible and more adequately addressed than the psychological ones. But they too came with costs and limitations that the triumphalist post-war narrative tended to minimize. The Veterans Administration hospitals that were supposed to care for physically wounded veterans were, in the immediate post-war period, overwhelmed and underfunded. The sheer volume of men requiring prosthetics, reconstructive surgery, physical rehabilitation, and ongoing medical care for wounds sustained in combat exceeded the capacity of the VA system to deliver it in the quality and quantity that was needed. The specific technologies of rehabilitation that had been developed during the war, better prosthetics, better surgical techniques for reconstructing damaged limbs and faces, better physical therapy protocols, were significantly advanced over what had been available after the First World War. But the gap between the best available treatment and the treatment that was actually delivered to many veterans was large. Men who had earned the right to good medical care by their military service were waiting months or years for procedures. They were housed in conditions that were inadequate. They were managed by a bureaucratic system that was not designed for the volume or the complexity of what it was being asked to handle. The political advocacy that veterans organizations provided, the American Legion, the veterans of foreign wars, the disabled American veterans, was essential to the continued improvement of the VA system in the post-war years. The GI Bill itself was partly a product of veterans' advocacy, and the ongoing lobbying for better VA funding and better services was a sustained effort that produced results over time. But the improvements came slowly, and the men who needed them in the immediate post-war years often did not get what they deserved. The African American veterans of the Second World War faced specific additional dimensions of the post-war experience that deserved their own examination. They had served in a segregated military, in units that were often given the most dangerous or the most menial assignments, in a military culture that reflected the racial hierarchy of American society. They had fought for a country that denied them the rights they were fighting to protect, that maintained in law and in practice the racial discrimination that was a defining feature of life for Black Americans in the South and a significant feature of life for Black Americans throughout the country. The experience of returning to this reality after fighting in the war, after wearing an American uniform, after being treated as equals by European civilians who did not share American racial hierarchies, after doing the same jobs and facing the same dangers as white soldiers, was for many African American veterans a specifically disorienting and specifically enraging experience. The civil rights movement that would transform American society in the 1950s and 1960s was fueled, in significant part, by the political consciousness of African American veterans who had come home determined to claim the democracy they had fought for. The specific violence directed at African American veterans in the immediate post-war period, the attacks on veterans in uniform, the particular targeting by white supremacist groups of men who had demonstrated that they were willing to fight, was one of the ugliest dimensions of post-war America. The lynching of veterans, the blinding of veterans by law enforcement in the South, the organized effort to prevent Black veterans from accessing the benefits of the GI Bill in the South through discriminatory implementation. These were not peripheral incidents, but expressions of a systemic racial order that was threatened by the very existence of Black men who had fought and won. The women who had served in the war, in the WAC, the WAVES, the WASP, and an industrial workforce that we discussed in an earlier episode, faced their own specific post-war transitions. The cultural expectation was that women would return to domestic life, that the wartime expansion of women's roles was a temporary measure necessitated by the emergency rather than a permanent change in what women could do and be. The women who had served as nurses in combat zones, who had flown military aircraft, who had managed factories and shipyards, were expected to step back from these roles and return to the domestic sphere that the post-war prosperity was making materially comfortable even as it narrowed its occupants' world. Some did so willingly and found genuine satisfaction in the domestic life they built. Some did so unwillingly, carrying the memory of what they had been capable of and what they had contributed into a domestic context that didn't know how to credit it. The specific psychological consequences of the post-war transition for women who had served in combat support roles, nurses who had worked in forward surgical units, women who had served in the Office of Strategic Services or other intelligence roles, have been less extensively studied than the men's psychological consequences. But they were real, and they were in some ways compounded by the specific invisibility of women's wartime service in the post-war narrative. The children of the greatest generation, the baby boomers who were born in the late 1940s and 1950s, grew up in the shadow of a war their parents had fought and largely would not discuss. The silence was so pervasive and so consistent that it shaped how the boomers understood not just the war, but their parents and themselves. The fathers who came home from the Pacific or from Europe and went back to work and mowed the lawn and didn't talk about it were transmitting, through their silence and their distance and their occasional explosive reactions, a kind of trauma that their children absorbed without having language for it. The specific dynamics of the veteran father and the boomer child, the distance, the difficulty of emotional intimacy, the sense of a father who is present physically but elsewhere in some more important way, have been widely discussed in American cultural and psychological literature and are reflected in the literature and film and memoir that the boomer generation produced. The war the fathers had fought was a central event of their lives, the thing that had formed them, the thing they couldn't talk about. The children who grew up in its shadow were shaped by its silence, as surely as the fathers had been shaped by its violence. The psychological understanding of what combat veterans experience and what their families experience in consequence has advanced enormously since the 1940s. The formal recognition of PTSD as a diagnostic category in 1980, the result of decades of advocacy by Vietnam veterans and the clinicians who work with them, provided a framework for understanding and treating conditions that the World War II veterans had largely had to manage without it. The neuroscience of trauma, the specific ways that traumatic experience changes the structure and function of the brain, the specific mechanisms by which traumatic memories are encoded and retrieved differently from ordinary memories, has transformed the clinical understanding of these conditions in ways that have improved treatment significantly. The veterans of the Second World War who came home with PTSD symptoms were not weak. They were not failures. They were human beings whose nervous systems have been shaped by experiences that no human nervous system is designed to absorb without consequence. The brains and bodies that carried them through combat, that kept them alive through experiences that were genuinely lethal to many of the people around them, were the same brains and bodies that continue to process those experiences long after the combat was over, in the dark, in the kitchen, at the kitchen table late at night, with a cup of coffee going cold. The silence that surrounded the veteran's psychological experience was not simply cultural negligence. It was, in part, the product of a generation's genuine effort to spare their families the burden of what they had seen and done. My grandfather didn't talk about the Pacific because he had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that there was no benefit to sharing it, that the things he had seen and done were his to carry and his alone, and that the people he loved should not have to carry them too. This was a form of love, however imperfect its expression. It was also a form of isolation, however well-intentioned. The particular dignity of the men and women who fought the Second World War and then came home and lived their lives, who raised their children and went to their jobs and built the post-war prosperity and did not, in general, ask for recognition beyond what the culture offered them, is real and should be honored. But honoring it honestly requires acknowledging the full cost. The nightmares, the distance, the marriages that broke, the children who grew up with fathers they couldn't reach, the veterans who drank themselves to death or who couldn't keep a job, or who disappeared into their own private wars that no one around them could see. The greatest generation was great. They did something extraordinary. They fought the most destructive war in human history, and they won it, and they came home, and they built a country. But they were also human beings who paid a price that the triumphalist narrative doesn't always acknowledge. And that price was paid not just by them, but by the people around them, the families they built, the children they raised in the shadow of a war they could not fully put down. This series has tried to tell the full story of the Second World War, not just the famous battles and the famous names, but the intelligence work that preceded the battles, the production that enabled them, the strategy that shaped them, the legal reckoning that followed them, the diplomatic negotiations that determined their consequences, and the human cost that outlasted all of them. The full story is larger than any series can contain, but it is a story that deserved to be told completely, with respect for both the achievement and the cost. My grandfather sat at a kitchen table and watched me eat a piece of pie, and he was very still and very far away. He had been at Tarawa. He had seen things that I will never see and cannot fully imagine, and he carried them for 30 years after the war ended and never shared them with anyone who loved him. He did his best with what he had. They all did. That is the truest thing I can say about the men who came home. They did their best with what they had, and what the war left them with was, in many cases, more than any human being should have to carry alone. They carried it anyway. That is the last thing the Second World War asks us to understand about the people who fought it. Not just that they were brave, though they were. Not just that they won, though they did. But that after the winning, they went home and lived with what the winning had cost them in silence for the rest of their lives. The war ended in 1945. For many of the men who fought it, it never entirely ended. That is the truth that the victory did not erase. And it is the truth that their memory deserves. The question of what we owe the veterans of the Second World War, and by extension, the veterans of all wars, is one that every generation answers differently, and the answers have changed significantly over the 80 years since the war ended. The immediate post-war period offered the GI Bill and the VA system, and the genuine gratitude of a country that understood it had been protected. The middle decades offered the mythology of the greatest generation, a narrative that honored the achievement, while sometimes obscuring the cost. The more recent decades have brought a more honest reckoning, a willingness to acknowledge the psychological wounds, to fund research and treatment, to build memorials and record oral histories and say, finally, what the silence had been covering. The obligation is not fully met. The VA system remains underfunded and bureaucratically dysfunctional in ways that veterans continue to pay for their health and their lives. The treatment of contemporary veterans, of the men and women who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and who carry their own versions of what the World War II veterans carried, reflects progress over 1945, but not the progress that was possible or that was deserved. The specific failures of the VA in recent decades, the wait list, the inadequate care, the bureaucratic obstacles, are a specific form of dishonoring the obligation that the country has contracted with the people who fight its wars. The World War II veterans are almost all gone. The obligation to them is now primarily historical. The obligation to remember honestly, to tell the full story, to honor not just the achievement but the cost. This series has tried to do that. Imperfectly, incompletely, but truthfully. They deserve the whole truth. They still do,